A reading from the book of Acts. Now there came to Ephesus a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria. He was an eloquent man, well versed in the Scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with burning enthusiasm and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus, though he knew only of the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue, but when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained the way of God to him more accurately. And when he wished to cross over to Achaia, the believers encouraged him and wrote to the disciples to welcome him. On his arrival, he greatly helped those who, through grace, had become believers, for he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, showing by the Scriptures that the Messiah is Jesus. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Well, friends, I want to say again how great it is to be here with all of you this morning. Thank you for welcoming me so warmly to Wilshire and to Texas. Jill, I heard you say there was a chill in the air. Yesterday when I walked off the plane, it just hit me, and I remembered almost 30 years ago when I stepped off the plane in Dallas, Texas for the first time, and I was a freshman at Baylor University. It all came flooding back to me with that heat. You can blame your male pastor for inviting me to preach today. I feel pretty sure he's still trying to make up for the time about 20 years ago when I was a very young, very green, brand new seminary graduate, and I read about a job opening at Wilshire Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas. And crossing my fingers, I sent in what I thought was a very impressive resume. You can imagine my excitement when I got the news that the pastor wanted to interview me on the telephone. And boy, was I nervous, but, I thought the interview went pretty well. Apparently he didn't. So I have for some time, and hope to continue for many years into the future, giving your pastor a hard time about not hiring me. Yet, despite the specter of rejection that hangs over our friendship, I'm sure it won't surprise you to know that George has been a great friend and mentor to me and so many others. And I want to thank you, Wilshire, so much for the work that you have done over these years together with George to help nurture excellent leaders who are going to help us Baptists and others in the institutional church find our way into a future that we cannot see. Because in case you haven't noticed, the institutional church in America is in sharp decline. You don't have to just take my word for it. In March of this year, the National Science Foundation published the results of a multi-million-dollar study providing data on all parts of American society. Well, in 1972, they found about 5% of Americans called themselves nones, as in no religion. In 2014, that group of nones was over 25% of all Americans. The study showed that over 1/3 of Americans never ever darken the door of any religious institution except for weddings or funerals. And there's a lot more data in that study, but all of the data points to the fact that American religion is in what scholars are calling the Great Decline. In summary, in 2012, about 7.5 million Americans would say they had lost their religion. Now, these statistics are enough to make those of us who love this institution we call the church just shake our heads in despair over what appears to be its coming death. Until we remember that we, followers of Jesus Christ, are not in the business of maintaining an institution. Well, change is hard, and we can't see the future of a church as we have known it in our lifetimes. We are here. You and I call ourselves disciples of Jesus Christ because we have pledged our very lives to this one who came to earth preaching a radical gospel of transformation, a message definitely not designed to support the perpetuation of institutions, but instead to challenge our assumptions about everything, to call us to what some may say is an offensive witness, to push us to the very limits of radical love and then push us beyond. Which is why the work that you are doing this summer, Wilshire Baptist Church, listening and looking hard to find the way of Christ for this gathered group of disciples of Jesus Christ in Dallas, Texas, in the United States of America in 2015 is so deeply, critically important. Because the way of Jesus is never the way of finding the perfect formula or maintaining the status quo. No, the gospel message is always transforming us individually and as communities and asking us again and again to open ourselves to God's ongoing healing, transformation, growth, witness. Always. In anticipation of this morning, as I read the passage assigned for today from the book of Acts, chapter 18, verses 24 to 28, I began to think about how critical it is for all of us who call ourselves disciples of Jesus Christ to sharpen our skills of observation. How important it is that we look harder, that we consider possibilities that perhaps we haven't ever considered before. Because sometimes the way of Christ is right there, right in front of us, inviting us to step out of everything that feels comfortable and even normal to join the work of God that is happening all around us. And sometimes the work of discipleship is challenging our easy assumptions, of gathering the courage to look for the way of Christ and then look again to places, to people, to situations we might have quickly dismissed before we remembered that God's Spirit is ever in the process of changing the world and changing us. The 4 verses that we heard from the book of Acts today find us peering into the story of the very first church at a time when they too were struggling with the institutional expression of the gospel message. Think about what a formidable assignment those first followers of the way had before them. They'd begun as a ragtag little group of followers who followed Jesus around all over the countryside for 3 years, groupies of a radical preacher who was challenging convention at every turn, making sure that no one within his earshot was immune from the discomfort of his pushback. And then he left. And they were, in effect, left holding the bag, tasked with the continuation of his message, a gospel that was perpetually challenging social convention and offending everyone. And by the time of our passage today, there had been a lot of water under the bridge since Jesus' ascension. Persecution from the outside had escalated. The church had been through significant changes in leadership, and the ongoing controversy of who is in and who is out had been taking so much of the church's emotional and interpersonal energy. And because of all those things, and because of the fundamental conviction that the gospel message must be shared, the church had dispersed far beyond Jerusalem, far beyond its birthplace, all over Asia Minor, in so many different cultures and languages and communities, spreading like Jesus had envisioned, like yeast in bread dough. And you can't imagine how difficult that set of circumstances made things like being predictable, or church as an experience of comfort and familiarity, or the way of Christ spread out before those first Christians like a clearly delineated pathway. There was no predictable. There was rarely comfort and familiarity, and the way of Christ was often difficult to discern, hard to see, scary to embark on. We can notice it all over the book of Acts and witness it over and over again in the stories of the first church. Very often, like us, they preferred predictable comfort and familiarity, a well-paved and clearly lit way of Christ. And when they cultivated that kind of church, we know from reading Paul's many letters in the New Testament, particularly to the church at Corinth, for example, that was when all sorts of trouble ensued. But sometimes they got it right. Sometimes those first Christians managed to move beyond their preconceived ideas. Sometimes they heard again those challenging words of the gospel. Sometimes they looked again for the way of Christ in places and people they would have never imagined. And they found it. I think these 4 little verses from the 18th chapter of the book of Acts tell of just such an occasion. The writer of Acts is recounting an incident here that happened in the church in Ephesus. Remember, the city of Ephesus was a bustling center for trade and commerce during the time of the book of Acts, and the city was home to the temple of the Greek goddess Artemis, which was around which so much of the business in the town circulated. And the Apostle Paul planted the church at Ephesus. He spent significant time there with some friends who had come with him from Corinth, Priscilla and Aquila. And then when Paul moved on to his next missionary journey, Priscilla and Aquila stayed in Ephesus to provide leadership for the church, this congregation that would become so significant in the story of early Christianity. So you and I enter the story when a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria who was gaining a reputation for fiery enthusiasm for the gospel and a Joel Osteen kind of appeal, well, he showed up in Ephesus and promptly headed to the temple to get busy preaching. We can probably assume that word of his arrival got out pretty quickly because Priscilla and Aquila had heard he was in town, and they went over to the temple to see what he was preaching. What they found supported everything they'd heard about him. He was eloquent. He obviously knew his material. And though the text doesn't say it, I strongly suspect that he also had very, very white teeth. And a winning smile. But somehow Apollos had missed the baptism of Jesus, which is probably insider language for missing the memo about the Holy Spirit's arrival. Whatever it is that made Apollos different, however, is not really the point. The point is that Apollos was not what they were used to. He was a Jew. He was a fellow Christian with a different perspective and a different approach, a different cultural background, maybe even a different language. He was young. He was ardent. He was an outsider. But they also noticed that he was preaching up a storm. His ministry had the potential to catapult the gospel message to a whole nother level. It would have been appropriate and even expected in church circles that, some of us, the old guard, leaders from the group of gathered Christians would come in and shut him down. Too different, too young, too uninformed. But look what happened instead. Gently, with an acknowledgement of the great gift of Apollos' enthusiasm and talent, 2 of the leaders in the church, Priscilla and Aquila, helped Apollos get the updates he needed. And next, the community itself celebrated the ways in which Apollos' preaching promoted the gospel, and then they sent him off on his next missionary journey with their blessing and support. You and I know with the clarity of hindsight that next to the Apostle Paul, Apollos was indisputably the most influential missionary of the early church, traveling and preaching and planting churches far and wide. But the church at Ephesus didn't know that. They only knew that Apollos was different. So we can see all over this passage the witness of these Ephesian Christians opening themselves to be changed, to find the way of Christ in places and among people they would not ordinarily have recognized. They could have just said, "Why don't you just stay with your kind? We don't really trust you. Please, don't come into our community and try to shake things up." But they didn't. Instead, they opened their minds and their hearts to the possibility that this unlikely voice, might illumine for them a way of Christ that they had never considered before. Now, if you've hung around the organized church for any amount of time, that kind of reaction should surprise you. I do not have to tell you that adjectives like grace-filled, prophetic, open to change, are often not used to describe the institutional church, or even Christians in general. But I suppose we shouldn't be surprised by those early Christians in the Ephesian church. After all, they'd been practicing lavish welcome and the open spirit of the gospel for some time. Remember what I said, Priscilla and Aquila were among their pastors, and really, who knew a man could pastor a church? It was radical. So in just these few verses, the Ephesian church shows us a group of gospel people that makes qualities like patience and grace and openness the rule of their community. And because they cultivated that kind of community with each other, when this unlikely turn in the way of Christ began to unfold before them, well, they just sprinted down it. They went boldly down that new way of Christ, and what happened? That outsider who they welcomed in, well, he took the gospel message into places it might never have gone otherwise. It's a story that's becoming almost legendary among preachers. It happened on January 13th, 2007, in my former hometown of Washington, D.C. Those of us who lived there read about it a little later in April that year in the Washington Post magazine. It's the story of Joshua Bell in the Metro. Now, I'm not the most sophisticated classical music fan, but I do know the name Joshua Bell, and you might too. Joshua is a 47-year-old one-time child prodigy. He commands enthralled audiences who pack the world's most prestigious concert halls and pay hundreds of dollars of tickets for seats to hear him play his violin. In January of 2007, wearing a baseball cap and jeans, Joshua Bell stood against a wall next to a garbage can in the L'Enfant Plaza metro station. He'd agreed with the staff of the Washington Post to try an experiment by which he would play his violin for 45 minutes. He would play his $3.5 million Stradivarius violin, built in 1713, in the metro station for 45 minutes during rush hour. And he would prop up his violin case on the ground, open in front of him, and throw in a few coins to seed the pot, just to see what would happen. He started his performance with Bach's Chaconne, which is apparently one of the most difficult violin pieces ever written, one which many violinists never master. And then he went on to play Schubert's Ave Maria, and he kept going for a whole 45 minutes, during which a video camera recorded 1,097 people walking past him. You can watch on the video and see that for the entire 45 minutes, Joshua Bell never attracted a gathered crowd. People were rushing too fast to wherever they were headed. No one expected a world-class musician in the L'Enfant metro station, and no one stopped to listen. At the end of his agreed-on 45 minutes, Joshua Bell had collected a total of $32, including the seed money he threw in at the beginning. All in all, only one person out of the 1,097 people who passed by Joshua Bell in the metro station that morning recognized him. Stacy Furukawa, a demographer at the Commerce Department, had been in the audience 3 weeks before when Joshua Bell had played a concert at the Library of Congress. After hearing him in the metro that morning, she said to a reporter later, "This is the most astonishing thing I have ever seen in Washington, D.C." She said Joshua Bell was standing there playing at rush hour, and people were not stopping. They were not even looking, and some were flipping quarters at him. Quarters. I wouldn't do that to anybody. And I was thinking to myself, oh my gosh, what kind of city do we live in that this could happen? What kind of church do we live in that we might ever miss the movement of God's Spirit inviting us to the way of Christ? I wonder what would happen if the institutional church, long known for its rigorous commitment to keeping things just the same and practicing the default positions of suspicion and exclusion, suddenly became an institution marked by lavish welcome, by entrepreneurial spirit, by a nimble response to the prodding of God's Spirit. What if instead of following, we led our broken and hurting world in naming injustice, in calling for change, in insisting on really, really living out that beloved community that so scandalized Jesus's detractors? I wonder, church, could we open our eyes to look? And then could we look again to see the way of Christ in people and places we never thought to look, to live through our own challenge and discomfort, to open our arms with lavish welcome, and to set out down the way of Christ boldly and with confidence? If we do, when we do, I know that we will look up ahead of us and see Jesus ever beckoning us further, further on the way. Wilshire Baptist Church, all of you, all of us, followers of Jesus the Christ, open your eyes. Look hard for the way of Christ, and then look again. The places you find it might just take you by surprise. Amen.